Hello, welcome back to the Roots Run Deep podcast. My name is Rafa, and I'm joined here with my co host. If you'd like to introduce yourself,
Hi everyone, I'm Kiara. Welcome back.
welcome back. And today we are on our eighth episode, and I feel like I say it every episode, but just looking at it, take a step back. 8 episodes is a lot, considering that these drop every single month and there's only 12 months in a year. I think that this is amazing being able to produce these podcasts, to have these conversations that very much need to be uplifted in our community when it comes to environmental justice. But yeah, just a little appreciation, and we could get started on what the topic is. And today's topic, we are going to be tackling what is renewable energy and why it's important. So we're going to give our personal definitions and then a more formal one that we get offline. So I'll start it off. And to me, renewable energy is a source of energy that is non extractive, and kind of just as simple as that. And
Yeah,
Kiara.
for me, it's like I think of renewable energy and I think of sustainability or just something that is more, I guess, similar to what you were saying, more regenerative. It kind of is able to maintain itself. Yeah.
Yeah. And the definition that we got from online is from the Department of Energy.gov. And it says renewable energy comes from unlimited, naturally replenished resources. So, for example, wind, sun, and tides. And with this topic, I think that it's very important for us to also look into what isn't considered renewable energy,
Mm-hmm.
just because I feel like a lot of us may not consider looking into the what we're really doing already. So, not renewable energy consists of like coal, natural gases, and oil. These are all examples that are, like we mentioned, our own personal definitions, that these are extractive. These are extractive practices that are forms of energy today.
Yeah, and for like to add on to the renewable energies, like if you're wondering like why coal, natural gas is in oil, like why is that considered? It's like another way of thinking of it is it's there's a limit to how much there is on this
Mm-hmm.
earth. Um, but as we get into it, we'll kind of discuss how that's kind of the complexity of all renewable energies is that they have their own limitations. And I think, yeah, that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And I guess we could segue into like kind of like going into to what you're mentioning right now, why renewable energy is so important right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I guess like if I'm asking myself that question, climate change is like the number one reason why we should focus on renewable energy. While I was doing some of the research for this episode, I got into kind of like a rabbit hole on more like climate issues and the climate crisis and why renewable energy coexist and why it should be talked about when we're talking about climate crisis. And I ran into a report from that was created by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, so the IPCC. They created a report where they calculate a lot of like the like emissions and some of the issues that we're facing in our environment, right? But when I was looking at it, uh, it was very hefty, a hefty report. So I kind of turned and pivoted more towards a kind of like summarized, um, basically a summary to the actual report from another website called the World Resource Institute, and their page will be on the description and also on the blog. The link to that article where they're just basically just summarizing everything. Um, but when I was looking at the whole report and the summary, it was talking a lot about how right now we have gone we have gotten an increase of our warming. So it's like right now it increased by 1.5 Celsius or 2.7 Fahrenheit. And if we're talking about climate change, then this is kind of like putting a focus on kind of like what we were talking about, the the way we produce energy now contributes to this climate issue, right?
Yeah.
So another thing that I think when we think about renewable energy and why it's important right now, I would say that it's because we need to see less natural disasters, I guess. It's also a very climate change like idea, but like we see a lot of like we mentioned in other episodes where we talk about wildfires, sea level rise, and flooding. Yeah, anything in that realm, I feel like all coexists in the whole why renewable energy needs to like be a thing that we're focusing on.
Yeah. And to your point, like talking about the climate crisis issue, I think it's also important to like reiterate the fact that I think a lot of times when we talk about climate change, people think like kind of like those movies, like that one movie, like what was it, 2012, where like those like super like post-apocalyptic, like the world is ending type movie. I think Independence Day, or there's another movie like that. Anyways,
Day after tomorrow.
yeah, there you go. It's like really like crazy, like chaotic weather all in one day or like within the span of a week. But it's like the reality is what you were saying, where it's like little by little, every year we go up a few degrees. We start seeing these like subtle changes. I think we'd kind of mentioned it in our wildfire last episode, how like it doesn't happen like overnight. It's slow, but it's noticeable. I think most of the world, like at this point, like I see it being more talked about in like media of like heat waves and like, you know, when it gets cold, like having like really intense rain and things like that. It's just like we've noticed like these slight shifts that have been happening over the years. And I think we're at the point where we see it's going to keep happening. And hopefully like that raises awareness for people to understand that this is a pressing issue. It's urgent. And that's why like, you know, things when it comes to like being more renewable, more sustainable are really important to talk about and to really invest time, energy, money into. But yeah, just kind of explaining that, like kind of reiterating what you were saying of like there's it might not sound as bad because it's like you said, like a few degrees, but like in the big picture it's really scary to think about, like every year things going up, like or things getting more intense or more like more catastrophic in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's funny I keep saying it's funny to bring this up, but it's not funny. It's interesting that you bring this up because I was just while I was reading that summary from the IPCC report is that they mentioned that if we continue being this like carbon intense like world where like, you know, that's the only way we obtain our energy, that by 2100, right? So like in 75 years from now, we will see um, an increase on temperature. I think I wrote it down. I think it was about 5.7 degrees Celsius or 10.3 degrees Fahrenheit of an increase. And we haven't seen any of those numbers exceed at least 2.5 Celsius or 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 3 million years. So in 75 years, we could get to that number, surpassing those numbers that we haven't seen in 3 million years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we think about it like 3 million years ago. So it makes you think the way that we're pivoting is not so healthy. We're kind of like working on our own extinction at this point, right? You know, and it makes you think about like how I mentioned this earlier, how it makes me want to reconsider like having children, you
Yeah.
know, because it it makes me really sad to know that they're probably not even going to experience the beauty that we still have right now, like when we go on hikes or like the water, you know. I feel like that's something that they might not experience, and you know, it starts to evolve more into like how we're organizers right now, and
Mm-hmm.
how we don't want anyone in the future of our community to experience something as catastrophic as this. You know, like it makes me really fearful of the future and not knowing if what we're potentially doing right now is actually going to help or not, you know. But it's such a pressing and urgent thing that we need to talk about, because 75 years from now it's really nothing. If you start thinking about 100 years, that's nothing, you know.
Yeah.
Like things happen a lot faster than you may think, you know. And that's not to say that each year for those that span of 75 years there's still going to be increases, you know, till we get those numbers that are like surpassing the ones that we had 3 million years ago on this planet. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add right
I
now.
I I I do. It's a little bit of a different topic in a sense, but I kind of wanted to segue back to like what are the different types of renewables, like give you more concrete examples, and like, to your point, kind of like why it is important to think about it, to be more curious and more open, maybe changing the way we view things, the way we view our consumption, and how these can be a part of that. Um, so I have a list, but it's like you can argue with me if you want um, on why I wrote the list exactly like this. I'll explain why, but I only put 4 examples on my list of types of renewable energies. Um, and those 4 ones, or the 4 examples, are solar, wind, hydropower, and geothermal energy. I'm sure most people are familiar with the first two, especially. Like, I think those are like the really common ones that we hear about.
Yeah.
Um, so I don't know if I need to explain, but solar is, solar panels. A lot of the time, they're these giant like panels that they just basically absorb the heat and energy from the sun. There's like a whole process that I cannot explain because I am not a scientist, but that's kind of bottom line what it is. And then there's wind power, which is wind turbines. I guess they used to be like, I mean, that's how I knew them to be called, was windmills, but I guess
Mm-hmm.
now they call them
The
wind
wind
turbines. They're like those little, I don't know what that toy is, like that little kids, like it's like the stick and then there's like the wheel and you can like blow on it. Essentially it looks like that. It's like these giant structures, really, really big. And there's like usually farms of them. So there's a bunch of them in a concentrated area. Those work by the wind blows them, they rotate, the turbine moves, and then that's how the energy is produced and like harnessed. Again, I can't explain it more in depth, but if you do know more about it, that'd be cool to like reach out and let us know. Anyways, moving on. There's also hydropower, which is, I think it's It's like somewhat commonly known. I don't think most people, especially, I think that one is in a way really, really dependent on where you live, like geographically, even though they all have their own kind of limitations to like where they are placed. But I think hydropower specifically, hydro as in water, so it's usually kind of similar to wind turbines. It's like these giant turbines that are in water, and like the definition that Rafa gave earlier, tides is usually like a big part of that, or just moving water in general. The moving water turns the turbines, that's how you get the energy. So that could be like in any moving or any body of moving water. So it can be like the ocean, it can be like a river, things like that. And then lastly on my list, I have geothermal energy. That one is one that I did not know anything about prior to this like research that I did. But geothermal energy is like, it's, which this is also like geographically, it says it's more limited, but I guess now there's more technology to kind of change that. But basically, it's like they, I guess, drill like these giant pipes into the earth, and from the heat that comes from the earth's core, that heat is like brought up and then used to like, generally the energy that they're using is heat, so it's like to heat people's water and things like that. So that one's really interesting. I don't really know that much about it. I put it on the list of renewables because in my research, it seems like it falls under that a lot. Yeah, those are my four. The reason that I put those four was because I feel like overall, like thinking on like a percentage kind of like perspective, like for the most part, they do a lot more in regards to sustainability. In a way, they are more renewable, because things like the sun is going to be there. It's a source where it's not like, how do I explain this? It's something that we will have, like at least on this earth, it is a consistent thing. Same thing with wind, because wind is actually dependent on the sun. And then hydropower is also, you know, most of this earth is made up of water. There is a lot of water on this earth. And then again, same thing for the geothermal, is similar in that we have the earth's core always there. But yeah, so the thing is with these four, I really feel like they're kind of the most solid examples of renewable energy. On my, I put controversial renewables list. I have two. Again, also, I'm not going to name every type, I'm assuming, because in doing all this research, I realized there's a lot of different technologies and claims to different things being renewable, or like ways to to generate energy in a renewable way. So on this list, I don't have everything, probably. I don't know. Maybe I do. Maybe I don't. That's something that's up for interpretation. But on my list of controversial renewables, I have bioenergy, which is sometimes referred to as biomass, and hydrogen. Bioenergy or biomass is, I'm going to loosely explain this. I'm going to give the most like direct example from my understanding. Again, there'll be more like articles and links in the blog to kind of explain and give more context, but I guess one like really easy way to think of bioenergy or biomass is like taking organic matter and doing something to it to get energy out of it. I like thinking of the wood example because you take a log and you light it on fire and it combusts and it creates energy. That's like the most direct way I can put it. There's a lot of other examples though, and there are different ways other than just burning to do that. But again, that will be referenced in the vlog. Then we have hydrogen. Hydrogen is one I kind of wanted to like spend a little more time on in a sense, not too much, but just to get into it a little bit more because I think it's more relevant to us locally. Hydrogen, again, kind of a complicated process, but the issue with hydrogen and why it's on my controversial list is because hydrogen can be considered green or renewable depending on how it's produced. And the same goes for bioenergy. The example that I give of burning wood, burning combustion, typically not renewable because it is letting out emissions, right? When you burn wood, there's smoke, there's things in the smoke, right? On a microscopic level, on a visible level. Same thing with hydrogen, depending on how there's machines that create the hydrogen to be used for energy. Depending on how those machines are, or the like plants are getting their energy, ironically, a lot of times, not a lot of times, but sometimes it can be from other fossil fuels that are being put into the machine to create the hydrogen. Sometimes it comes from a more like sustainable process. Like I think it's electrolysis, which is like doing something with electricity to like get your machine to go. I don't understand that much, but that being the most sustainable aspect, and then or the most sustainable way to produce hydrogen. And then there's like a whole rainbow of ways that people classify hydrogen depending on how it's produced, and that's like a controversial thing in and of itself because of the like differences in opinion. Same thing with my list. You might have completely different opinions on like what is renewable and what isn't. I think it's interesting to kind of see how it varies from person to person. And that being said, I think that's a part of the issue that we can get into a little bit more of like renewables as a whole being something that is not very precise or like black and white. There's a lot of complications and again like difference in opinions that kind of play into how things are classified on a like local level, on a federal level, on a global level. It's really interesting to like look into this stuff and see how basically everybody has their own opinion, and especially because I mean more and more people are starting to invest in it, but for a long time they were not heavily invested in, so there's just a lot of unknowns. And yeah.
Yeah, touching a little bit more on like it not being so black and white, like how we might want it to be, just so we can like, do better for our environment. The aspects that are getting ignored are usually the ones that are the most important to keep in mind when it comes to trying to create these renewable energy sources, right? So if we're thinking about wind turbines, the hydropower, everything needs to still be sourced. So, for example, one of the issues that I saw that California has is that solar energy being the most prominent one here in California. There's a lot of energy being produced by solar to the point where like it can't be stored anywhere. So if we have all of these solar panels, we need to create more batteries to store all of the energy that those solar panels are producing if we want to be, upholding the expectations of today's consumption on energy. And I can't remember exactly where I saw it, but I think it was called like the duck curve, where like in California, like I mentioned, we produce way too much energy to the point where like some of it needs to just like get dispersed or like kind of think about it like it being thrown away.
Yeah. Because if you're thinking of like that makes me think of, like you're saying, like the idea of like the duck curve and all that. Like basically what happens in California, the reason for that is like there is not enough infrastructure yet, or really, I don't know. I actually don't know if that's really like a thing anywhere. I think in general, like globally, there's not enough efforts, or no, I don't want to say efforts actually, but there's not enough infrastructure on a large scale to be able to like handle that much energy. And the issue that happens with that is like you might be like, oh well, like if we have more than enough, like who cares? The issue with that is it, like Rafa said, it's you're basically kind of like throwing it away. So in a way it's kind of doing the opposite of what you want, right? Like if we could have all that energy stored, then there would be less of a need to continue to produce it. Or like if there was a way to like actively be able to distribute it to everyone, then more people would have access to it. I think that's what we see in California. And this is all like, not all, but a lot of this is anecdotal and just like based off of like my opinion. But I feel like not having that infrastructure, and I think this is kind of true of most things, like when you don't have things on a like large systemic scale to be able to handle the amount of people, the amount of like need that there is for stuff, then there's gonna be a bunch of gaps that start happening. And I think with renewables, especially with solar and here in California, from what I know of like different types of incentives and like rebates that were really pushed here in California, there's a lot of barriers to be able to access those. So the people who tend to get the benefits of it are people who are already like financially more stable or more like, you know, wealthy even. And you would think, right, like the whole point of adding the like tax write-offs and making it cheaper would be so it I laugh because I just think of trickle down. But it doesn't. It does not trickle down to people who actually need it. From like I've kind of understood a lot. Like I myself have done a lot of research like independently for my own like family and lifestyle and like different renewables, and solar obviously was something I looked into. And right off the bat, like if you're not a homeowner, disqualified from essentially every type of program that you could potentially apply for. Same goes for like income, certain income requirements. We know California has like really, really messed up scales when it comes to that, just because like what is considered below the poverty line for some is not for others, and it's just like it's a really complex thing. So it doesn't always work right. I don't know how to say that better, but it just there's like a lot of issues there. Again, solar itself being so expensive off the bat, it's like complicated. I know there's like you can finance it or you can just buy it like straight off, but I think it's like any big purchase you might make, like a car or I don't know, like a refrigerator or something. It's like, yeah, you have the option to finance it or just pay it all up front, but both are very like expensive, and not everyone has the like the resources to be able to do that. So yeah, when I think of like everyone having access to it, I think the real issue is not even just like, of course there's a lot of unknowns in regards to the science and the technology and the like duration of these things, but it's also a big part is the infrastructure and like systemically, like do we even know like what to do with it? And I think that plays a big part into like just transition and like the idea of it. Why it's important to have a just transition is to be able to think these things before, like, or think these things through and like understand what the plan is beforehand. Because I mean, I don't know if you have anything else to say about the access part of it. We can like keep going with that if you want.
Yeah, no, that I feel like you covered it. I think there was one more thing that you wanted to say. I forgot already.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna kind of like segue or like change it into kind of because we talked about the gaps, and one of those being obviously financial, but I think another aspect of why all of the renewable energy sources can be not so like I yeah, I guess you can't just say, you can't generalize and call them good. Can't call them bad either. They're very in the middle, and especially depending on a lot of different factors. But one that they, I think for the most part, all share in common, is the idea of land use. And I think land use in multiple ways too, because like you had touched on already, the idea of the batteries that are used to store the energy from solar. You know, lithium is something that is mined, right? It comes from the earth, so it has to be dug up, and that is almost always going to be a bit of an issue with things. I think people think of like coal, and like you kind of understand why it's bad in a sense. Lithium is somewhat similar, but overall, like the actual issue is like you're taking something away, right? You are depleting the earth in some way to be able to create a thing. And a lot of the times where these lithium mines tend to be are obviously in other countries, where people do not have the autonomy to be able to control their resources. It's usually huge colonial states that come and extract and extract and extract. In this case, here in the US, we go to places like in South America, and we go to these countries and we make whatever agreement with their government, not their people, and we get the access to be able to continue to extract whatever material we need, and then bring it here, make these batteries out of it, and call it sustainable, which is not true at all. So I'm gonna link like an article that does touch on the idea of like how land use for these renewable sources is not exemplifying the just transition model. I believe in this article it's talking about not solar. I think it's it is solar. I think it's solar and wind power. But how oftentimes these farms, like I mentioned before, a lot of times those two specifically are like in these big clusters, or like these big groups. There's just a bunch of them. So solar and wind a lot of the times are put in places that are stolen from indigenous and native people, and not, there's no like contract or consent given. It just happens. It is stolen land. So that in and of itself, again, is not sustainable, because also the idea of the depletion of those sacred lands ties into the fact that, it's I think of the word greenwashing, but I'm sure there's a lot of other ways to refer to it, but it's just the idea of saying this is a good thing, but it's like, is it really? Like, because a lot of the times there's another side to that story. But yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but again, I'm just like bringing that up, that it's a lot more complicated than just good or bad.
Yeah.
But I think it's still important to look at both sides, or all sides, right? It's not even just like those two. Yeah.
No, yeah, I agree. Because, sorry, I agree. What you were mentioning was like a really good perspective of like the two sides to things. Sometimes it's being pushed and proposed as like the best thing that we could have here, either in the community or for the environment or globally. People talking about, like, for all I know, like, people keep saying that, like, when we use hydrogen, right? Let's just say that there's a hydrogen car, there's no emissions. But when we're thinking about how we the hydrogen hub here in our community was proposed, it was that it was gonna burn some stuff to like the landfill trash to create hydrogen. But
I guess technically with this specific company, it was more of the way it was explained was, or the way that it's expressed is that they don't burn the biomatter per se, but I think it has to do with, again, and this is an issue in and of itself, right? I understand that like not everybody needs to understand all the science behind all this stuff, but at the same time, I think the more, and I think this is like true from like anything to like, I don't know, the food you eat, it's like the more complicated and complex, you can only start to question why is it that you don't even understand what's happening. And I think especially like, you know, people in communities like ours, fence line communities, like there's always someone who's like, oh yeah, this is like a really great thing. And there's a lot of like words thrown out and jargon that like nobody really understands. And it's like, yeah, just trust us. And I think we've all experienced that. Like those are situations that always are to our own detriment and they create a lot of harm. And so I think there's already that like that suspicion that we have. And I think it's actually completely valid because like it's happened before and it's historically happened. It's not anything new. So I think with this, it's like they explain it as it being something that doesn't burn because I believe part of their process uses electrolysis. But I don't know if you want to get into that part, but like the partnership that they have, or basically people who own a lot of their company, fossil fuels. So you can only imagine, right? Like, doesn't, you know, think what you want.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, like there's always two sides to what's being proposed, and sometimes it could be majority negative, even though it's like proposed as like the best thing that our community can have. But yeah, I think that I just wanted to tie that like local example just because it's very important for us to keep that in mind, that it's not happening across the ocean. It's also happening right in our backyards, you know.
Yeah, and I do want to add too that like for that project specifically, it's gonna happen. It was approved. There was a lot of pushback from a bunch of different environmental organizations here in Richmond and just locally. So there were people who were fighting for it not to happen because of, you know, all these unknowns. And it still got approved because they argued enough that there is no way to know that they're actually like doing any harm or like basically invalidating all the arguments that were being said to oppose it. And I think that's just unfortunately a really common occurrence, especially here locally in Richmond, North Richmond specifically, is we have that air of suspicion or we don't trust people, which is again valid.
Very valid.
And they get to override that because, well, it's innovative. I have learned to kind of hate that word. I feel like it's genuinely rooted in so much white supremacy and just like a very dominating mentality of like we have to like own and control the land and like get what we want out of it versus like working with it and like respecting it. And you know, anyways, I think innovation, it's complicated, but yeah, that's the argument. And I think because people get excited, which again I also understand, I'll say like to myself, like I remember when I first started getting into like environmental justice work, I remember this so vividly of like I had taken minimal classes in college and had a very loose understanding of renewable energy resources. And I remember from my education, I thought nuclear power plants were like one of the best things, right? Because they produce so much energy, and it's like contained and all this stuff. Yes, catastrophic if something went wrong, but in my mind, it was like, that's the worst case scenario that can be said with anything. And then the more work that I started doing with environmental justice and like learning about like that extractive idea of like where we source our resources, where we get get these things a lot of times is from the earth, and then bringing up these facts and these points that we're making right now of like, for nuclear power plants you need uranium, and uranium is also something that is mined. And again, very, very common historical thing that happens here in the US is a lot of the uranium is on like reservations, so they kind of just like come in and take that without giving the people who actually like stored the land any say in it. I was watching a video about it. I think I don't know if it's New Mexico or something. I will link this video. It's a good video. It's like a journalistic investigation on like uranium mining happening somewhere here in the US. And it's just taking into account like all the different aspects and the sides to it. But just seeing like the indigenous activists who are like out there literally fighting with signs, sharing their story about how like they want to stop these people from just taking their land and like ruining it, right? Like they're just digging it up for the uranium to make these power plants. And it's because it's innovative and it can give us so much energy that it's argued that it's not a bad thing, right? Like we need more energy. And I don't know. I just don't think that's a fair take. But yeah, it kind of just goes to show that like I think there is like a want to do good, but I think a lot of times, and I think that's what greenwashing really showcases, is like there's a want for people to do better, and then there's always going to be the bad people. Bad, I say bad loosely. There's always going to be the people who take advantage of that. And so they'll market it as we're doing the good thing, but they're not. One last thing that I wanted to touch on. I mean, I feel like it was touched on a bunch of times, but I think just to get a little bit more into it is like the idea of what, and I I always have a hard time with this because like you mentioned, like we're not here on our soapbox telling people what to do. That's kind of the last thing I personally want to do, because I just don't think that is helpful really most of the time. But at the end of the day, there's always something everyone can do, big or small. And when it comes to energy, I think energy is a really funny one because I think a lot of times people are like, it's this like this distance we have from like where it comes from, and all the actual like details of it. So it's like, well, there's enough energy, like I think, yeah. And especially if in this situation we're talking about California having too much energy, then it's like, well, then what's the issue, right? We can just keep using. And it's a lot more complicated and stuff, but the infrastructure being like a big part of it, that first of all, there's not really like a way to do this in a way that's equitable to everyone. And then also on top of that, it's the idea that there's always, I mean, I think in general, like here in the States, we are, I don't want to say horrifically, but we're so privileged in a lot of ways. And, I don't know exactly, I could look up the numbers, but I know the US, just like with most things, is probably one of the like biggest consumers of energy. And I think we are all really used to using energy in a not so intentional way. And that is part of the issue at the end of the day, right? Like, as much as we're talking about renewable and sustainable and things that can kind of heal themselves, the earth, like everything is still limited to a degree, right? Like everything is limited, and then everything that is created cannot be uncreated. Like, issue with trash, like once it's there, it's there. But when it comes to energy, I don't know. I'm not going to tell you to go out there and spend however many thousands of dollars to get solar panels. But I think it's just like the little things of just being more conscious. I don't know. Yeah. I always especially try to like, I don't know. I know maybe some people are used to like leaving lights on at certain times and stuff. I'm pretty like picky about that. Like if I can help it, I'll try to use minimal energy as possible. Yeah, I don't really have like any concrete like things for people to take away, but it's just I think it starts with just a thought, thinking about it. I think
Yeah.
thinking about how maybe like I don't know ways you can and maybe ways you can't also. I know there's like a lot of barriers to like I know especially like some electrical companies or energy companies like take that into consideration of like people who might have like certain medical like machines and technology that they need to like power consistently, and I think it's just like up to those of us who don't have to deal with that in a sense, right? Like if you have to, you have to, but if you don't, maybe think about not. I don't know. That's the
Hmm.
best way I could put it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just be mindful, be intentional. And I feel like that's something that like we try to always like make it a takeaway in these podcasts is to just be mindful of everything. All we can do is just be mindful and intentional about the energy that we're using. Be intentional about your carbon footprint. Be not so extractive. You know, I feel like that's the best way to put it for me. I want to shout out a comment. Uh, the most previous episode that we had was on California wildfires. The comment reads, really important episode, got us thinking about different ways to organize for community resilience and disaster preparedness. And this comment came from someone with an of user SK1MQ. Shout out to the person who left that comment, and they said thank you. And yeah,
Yeah. I
I
thank you.
yeah,
I appreciate that. I feel like Rafa just said, like all we can do is like help give more information and more context and then ask you to be a little bit more curious because I don't know. I feel like that's the best you can do. That's the best you can do.
yeah. And I also want to just like state something that I feel like it's very important for listeners to know is the fact that a lot of the time when we're bringing up these topics, you hear us say the research we made or the research that we found or, you know, the resource that we found. Um, a lot of the time, these topics are on books, on, you know, people dedicate a lot of time to, you know, create research for the community. And I just want to say that it also takes a long time for us to uh, put time into these topics and really find the information and make it a little bit more accessible for our community. So, yeah, kind of a pat in the back for us just because it is something that I feel like it's very common in our communities as organizers is to we have to become professionals, these scientists sometimes to try to figure out what certain words mean. So um, hopefully our listeners feel that same way.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, like, I hope if you're listening, like, you just feel encouraged to be able to, like, take that on. And in a sense, it's, you know, it's not ideal that we have to be the ones to, like, teach ourselves. But I think at the same time, there's a lot of resiliency in that. And, like, it's really important. I think I'm not an expert in any of this. Like, I just poorly probably described all the processes of how these like renewable energies work, but at the end of the day, like, it's the best I can do. And I just want to encourage people to be able to like feel comfortable like googling or going to your local library, and like, you know, there are a lot of ways to figure out this information, and it's not always the most accessible. Like we mentioned, like reading some of this stuff, it's so heavy in like information that is like really hard to understand, but you know, just at least trying and opening that door, I think is worth it a lot of the times.
Yeah. Yeah. Setting that intention too, you know, it's it's beautiful. It's beautiful that we have the ability to do that. But yeah, I kind of want to say thank you to the last person who commented, and we appreciate everyone who's listening. If you leave a comment, we'll shout you out. And, this is just a thing that we're trying to promote, to just keep uplifting these conversations because they're very important to, keep it circulating. And I think it's very cool. I don't know if I said this earlier, but I think it's really cool that we're recording these episodes, and let's just say the timeline that you're in, it's 5 years from now and you're listening to these back right now. I think it's very important to still uplift these conversations, especially this one, because there's still no really good structure to it. And I hope that in 5 to 10 years, maybe even 75 years from now, that is a lot better now. And we have done our due diligence to take care of Mother Earth. So, yeah, I guess this is us signing out now. And yeah, if you have anything else to say, Kiara.
No, just take care of yourselves, and whenever you're listening to this, hope you're having a good day, good night, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.